Hello and welcome to the Freelance Business Month. I am more than excited to launch this absolutely incredible opportunity for all of us to learn and connect. And we want to feature various topics, starting from the state of freelance economy, ending with HR and freelancers relationship, and what can be done in between, how to start your freelance business, how to grow your freelance business. And I hope that during the month, you'll find lots and lots of opportunities to connect with like-minded and find inspiration. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our keynote, John Younger. John is HR thought leader. He's an author, writer. He's an angel investor. And John writes for Forbes about Freelance Revolution. That's why he is here today to tell us where this revolution is heading. I am more than delighted to welcome John in this virtual room. Great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of this conference or event.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'd like to talk about the freelance revolution, the topic that you cover so much in your work. And to start with, I'm wondering, how did you start your independent career?
You know, there are two answers to that, and I'll give you some of the context that I thought was interesting. When I graduated from the University of Toronto a very long time ago, I had a choice of whether to move into academics full-time or to teach part-time and also work for industry. And I had a wonderful opportunity to do that through a great company, Exxon, before Exxon was Exxon Mobil and when it was just Exxon. And they gave me a tremendous amount of opportunity in a variety of ways. They gave me great work, they gave me great education, and they also lent me out from time to time to work on social projects. So, for example, I was lent to the Canadian government for 6 months for their study of research in the government, how research was funded and what needed to be done to improve funding for research in Canada. And then I was lent out again to help the chief of staff to the new prime minister, leaving the original Mr. Trudeau, not his son, who's now prime minister. And I spent a couple of days working with him to help him get up to speed as a consultant. My background was a consultant, and that's what I did in Exxon. And what I found, Elena, was that it was a lot of fun to do these projects. And so I became what we call in the freelance world a side gigger, where every once in a while I would do a project, but I had a full-time job. I continued to have full-time jobs and continued to be a side gigger until 2012, when I sold my shares in my consulting firm. We had been very fortunate, and two companies that I had been part of had gone public, had taken to the public market. So we were financially in a secure place, if I may put it that way. And then decided I was going to sell my shares and do independent consulting for a few years as a transition to retirement. Well, one of those projects was for McKesson. McKesson is the large international pharma distribution company. And they had asked me to help them with a project in HR, which is what's their strategy for HR, where was it headed, and what do they need to know about some of the strengths and weaknesses. And my comment to them was, you know, the most interesting thing I found was that 30% of the people who work for McKesson aren't McKesson employees. They're freelancers or contract workers or side giggers. And what I also found was that HR wasn't interested in them because HR only loved full-time people. And that was a call to arms for me. It was so interesting. And so I started to dig into it. And what I found was that McKesson was by no means the only company that was depending increasingly on freelancers. That there were many, that on average, companies were more and more using freelancers to top up on demand when they had specific technical or professional needs. I found it so interesting. I started to write about it. I wrote a book about it for Harvard Business School. I wrote a bunch of articles for the Harvard Business Review, and then sent an article unsolicited to Forbes and said, would you be interested? And they said, we're not interested in publishing unsolicited articles, but we like your work. So would you write for us? And the rest is history. It's really been, for me, the combination of freelance work, but also the technology that allows me to talk to you. When I first started doing freelancing, the closest we had to our conversation was the tiny browser in the compact original portable laptop. Now, you are not old enough to have seen that in person, but I'm sure you've seen pictures. And it weighed 26 pounds, and we had to lug it home. And crazy, you could only see 3 lines at the time. Things have changed. And now we have Zoom, and we have Slack, and we have Whereby, and we have all sorts of other ways that we can connect that makes freelancing so much easier than it was in what I would call the old days, if I may say that.
All right. Well, that's interesting. That actually leads to my other question that I
Sure.
really wanted to ask. When you started and comparing with where we are now, how different, what are different issues freelancers are having? Or is it maybe the same?
I think it's a combination. So if I think about the background to freelancing, there's some very interesting research called the meaningful work research. It was done by Edward Dici and some other people. Dici was teaching at the University of Rochester, and he was one of those guys that you may have remembered the difference between, in the old psychology research, extrinsic and internal or intrinsic motivation. And he was the guy that really talked about that stuff with a fellow named Victor Vroom at Yale. Well, Dici went on to talk about what work actually creates meaning for us. And it found out that 3 factors are most important. The first factor is autonomy. And we want to have some control over our lives. All of us do. Second was competence. I want to feel as though I am capable of making a contribution in whatever area I choose. And so having the skill and the behavioral attributes of competence becomes very important. And of course, we'll talk a little bit later. The soft skills, so to speak, are just as important in freelancing as the hard skills, etc. There's a third factor, and the third factor is connectedness. So people want some autonomy, some flexibility, some control over their life. They want to express a competence or an expertise in something that they're doing, but they also want to feel as though they're part of something bigger. That may be a community, it can be a research project, it can be any number of things, but people want to feel connected to others working in similar ways. Wow, that's a very good recipe for freelancing.
That's interesting.
And it describes me. I wanted autonomy. I wanted to continue to grow as a competent and skilled professional. And I wanted to feel a part of something, but that's a tricky thing. I wanted to feel a part of something while I was a part of that thing, but didn't have, for example, if I look at my father worked for 30 years in the Treasury Department, the taxation department of the US government. For my father, connectedness was feeling part of that community for a career, feeling as though 30 years of relationship was very important for him feeling settled. I just spoke to a fellow named Steve Rader, who's the Associate Director of Innovation for NASA, just before our call. Steve's a friend. I said, Steve, how long have you worked there? He said, 31 years. I fell in love with space, and that was it. For me, connectedness has more to do with shorter bursts than it does with a long tradition. And so the difference between why my father wouldn't have been a freelancer, is that he he wanted to live in that one place called the government because it gave him everything, and he felt proud, he felt connected, he had agency, etc. For me, more of a project orientation, which works for freelancers much better than for people that want one relationship over the course of a career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that connectedness is a very universal feature, that it's just different nature depending on how you look at it, right?
I love that. That's a very good way to describe it. Well said. It's a versatile concept. Absolutely.
Thanks. And in the moment of transition that we are now, what freelancers need to know or to do to be successful, and how not to miss the train of opportunities that's coming now with this wave of change?
Sure. It's a wonderful question. Let me tell you. Let me answer it in a couple of different ways because there's a few different. It's versatile, as in the earlier concept. The first question is, what is it that freelancers in general want from the platforms with whom they work? Platforms or organizations or marketplaces, etc. And marketplaces have been a relatively recent invention. The original platforms, companies like People Per Hour in the UK, or Upwork, Elance, Odesk in the US, they were job boards less than 15 years ago. That was it. Now they're quite sophisticated, using SaaS methodologies, etc. But the thing that people want from those platforms, whether it's Upwork or it's your platform or it's any platform of freelancers, they want 5 things. The first thing they want is work. They want opportunity. We need to feed our families. The second thing they want is an ongoing stream of work opportunity that gives them the confidence that this platform is a good place from which they can grow as a professional. Third, they want help running their business. This is very important because freelancers sometimes don't understand that they're at an emotional level, that they're really entrepreneurs. They are business managers. They are solopreneurs, as we call them very often. And as solopreneurs, they need to learn to manage their business. They need to learn how to budget. They need to learn how to plan. They need to learn how to set their own strategies. They need to learn how to establish relationships and build their network. They need to decide how to price. This is not a simple thing. And they need to know how to collect. Because if you're good at pricing, you're good at working, but you're not good at collecting the money that you have earned, you have a problem. There are 2 other factors. The fourth factor is that they want help from their freelance platform in what we call future-proofing their skill set. If you think about it, the half-life of HR, let's use HR as an example because that's my background. If you were to ask me 5 years ago the half-life of HR, that is to say, when half of what I've learned at university and in my work is no longer relevant because things have moved, I would have said it's quite a long period. But now with big data and analytics, with automation, and the notion of freelancers beginning to create flexible blended workforces, the half-life of HR knowledge has gotten much smaller because you have to understand big data. You have to understand analytics to be effective. You have to be a good consultant around performance management, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important, whatever your field is, to understand the need you have to stay relevant, to stay present, to be on trend. If it's 8 years, it may be 5 to 10 years. If it's medical, it may be 18 months. If it's AI, it may be 12 months. You've got the job of continuing to do that. And the last piece is that you want to feel, again, as the connectedness part of a community. Now, if you take those things and then you bring them forward to me personally, what's my obligation? The most important obligation I have, Alina, is to recognize that I'm running a business and recognize that ultimately it's my responsibility to find my clients. Now, this is why this is so important. If you think about the platforms that folks have that you've created and other people have created, the problem with that is only 5 to 10% of the work currently of freelancers globally actually comes into the landing pages, if you will, of your freelance digital marketplace. 90% of the business of freelancing continues to be negotiated, delivered, created through relationships. And so the number one responsibility of a freelancer is to remain technically and professionally on track. The number two is to recognize that you're not going to get a full dinner at somebody else's table. That you've got to set the table yourself. That the best freelancers are not only finding opportunities for themselves, but they're actually finding opportunities for other people within the platform. The third thing that freelancers need to do to be successful is to be very clear about where they stand relative to the in-demand functions or professional areas that are most important. And right now, let's use an example. If you are in the business of AI or machine learning or robotics, there are many more people, many more opportunities, many more jobs as a freelancer than there are people who are expert at that. It's not the same in other areas of freelancing. If you're a creative, if you're in events, if you are, in hospitality, it's a very tough time. And you have to work that much harder, and you can't expect that the platform will deliver enough work for you on your own. And let me give you some specifics. Last year, Upwork's Stefan Casriel, who was recently replaced as the CEO of Upwork, but had done a very good job. This is not a bad thing that he did. Stefan left, and he and I had a conversation. I said, Stefan, what percentage of people actually get work on Upwork? How many people, what percentage actually get work? He said 4%. Not much. If you ask the folks at Fiverr, if you ask the folks at Gigster, if you ask the folks at Freelancer, you'll see that for many of these platforms, the largest platforms, the reality is not very many people get work. Patreon, the creative site that was just talked about in so many different ways, and I think they have some fabulous stuff, less than 3% of the population makes even minimum wage. So the big message to your freelancers is work closely with your platform, work closely with Elena or whomever, but recognize that you're not going to be served a full meal without your help in generating opportunity yourself. And that means we go back to the basics. You've got to understand what you're offering. You've got to understand what your customers want. You've got to understand what it takes to be successful. You've got to manage your budget. You've got to manage your brand. You've got to build your network. You've got to be out there, like any business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So you do need to understand technology and apply it, but to develop your relationship in the first place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's the way, if you think about, there's some interesting stuff happening in the area. So if you think about the original freelancing platforms were, as I said, job boards. Not very much. And then they moved into SaaS models, but SaaS model services a service-based models using SaaS. What would happen is you created organizations that were hub and spokes. What I mean by hub and spokes is it all came into one aperture, and then it would be distributed. The marketplace would distribute the opportunities to their freelancers. Well, again, it's not a robust way to get that work. So you've got to make sure that you are working very hard to build and reinforce your network. And platforms, Elena, are moving in that direction where instead of individuals joining, more and more, they're inviting teams and even small boutique firms with the idea that members of a platform will help one another. And so you're starting to see incentives. For example, if I bring more work to the platform, I will get a small amount of the percentage of that as a finder's fee. These are things that just make it easier for more people to benefit from these platforming opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like to quote what I've read, sorry, in your article. You say freelancing is still a relatively immature industry with cultural barriers to growth. So let's talk about barriers, because it all looks fascinating, right? We can work with each other, but what are the barriers, and whether all the countries are on the same level of freelance economy right now?
You know, it's all over the place. It's so interesting. I'll give you an example. Um, let me start by describing the categories of freelancing, because it actually makes a difference. So there are sort of 4 or 5 big categories of freelancing. One is technical, right? The techies that do the software and the hardware and the websites and the AI and the machine learning and the robotics, all that stuff. The second category that you could call the disintermediation or the disruption of agencies, right? Marketing, advertising, PR have all been disrupted and disintermediated by these platforms. And you can find lots and lots of platforms that are specific to writers, that are specific to marketing people. PR Cavalry in the UK is an example of that. Indie List, the Irish group I spoke with yesterday, very much like that. Third category is independent management consultants. They used to work for McKinsey or BCG or Bain or PwC or Accenture. One of my sons, now working for TopTal, was a consultant for Accenture and PwC, and now a lot of people have moved out of that. Fourth, it is, a variety of really interesting professions. Everything from space flight at Spacely, doing really high tech stuff, to I guess there's a platform that offers retired diplomats if you need diplomacy work as a government, et cetera, et cetera. So what's true is that all of those different platforms, and there are a great variety of those platforms. My personal favorite of all of them is urban.co by a guy named Jack, that offers yoga and massages, and gave 650,000 massages to people in France and the UK last year. I'm so impressed with that. So when you talk about sort of cultural barriers, the biggest barrier is, you have to be on site or can you work remotely, right? And what we know is that for a very long time, it's been easier for tech people to work remotely because you can send it in remotely, right? You can participate that level. Independent management consultants have had a much harder time with the cultural barrier of, if you're not on site, then we don't want to work with you. They're just now, as a result of COVID, accepting the possibility of that remote work. The second, so you're seeing big differences in the receptivity of these different categories of work and these different categories of organizations to remote versus on-site. Second dimension is many countries still believe that if you're a freelancer, you couldn't get a real job. You couldn't get a good job. You couldn't work in the best companies. That's changing, but it's changing slowly in some places versus other places. For example, in the Middle East, it's changing much more slowly than it is in some parts of Europe and certainly some parts of the States. Third, different parts of the world are less open still to these kinds of roles. Latin America is still just starting in this area. And so you meet great companies in Chile and Bolivia and Colombia, but it's still a slow sled for them to do it. So the real message here is that if you add up all of the platforms currently operating, all of the companies, and they're somewhere about 800, 900, though who knows the exact number. It's still less than the IPO of Snowflake yesterday. One company in the US, NASDAQ, that's just gone public and offers a different way of cloud networking and cloud data collection, cloud data holding. All of those 800 are less than this one IPO. So it's still a very new industry. The first of these platforms really started around 2007. So it's less than 15 years and less than one company's value. We've got a long way to go, and we've got a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, it's a young industry indeed, but I guess COVID crisis has accelerated many things and also transformed the way freelancers work and also corporates.
Yes.
But we also know that some legislation somehow restrict corporates into going completely into hiring freelancers.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
no, I interrupted you. Please go on.
No problem. My question here, and I wanted to hear your opinion, what freelance communities can do actually to accelerate the acceptance of freelance concept?
It's a great question. And the most important thing that they can do is to organize. There's an old expression which is the rising tide lifts all boats. And the more that freelance is accepted in Belgium, the more likely it's going to be accepted in Ghana. The more it's accepted in Ghana, it means more likely that it's going to be accepted in Chile. So this is a worldwide phenomenon, and the most useful thing that can happen is that there's a collaboration among these platforms, which helps all of the platforms grow in stature, in opportunity, etc. That's one. Second thing, we've got to think in terms of some standards. I'm the least bureaucratic person I know, but standards becomes important. I'll give you an example of this that may or may not be as relevant in Belgium as it is here in the States, but I'll give you the example. One of the sites on Patreon, and the way Patreon works, is a very large platform for creatives, and it's looking for patrons in a sense, right? So you might pay $3 or $5 or $10 a month to support an artist or a filmmaker, etc. Well, it turns out one of the sites at Patreon is run by somebody who is an advocate of what's called QAnon. QAnon in the States is a very terrifying organization that believes that there's a conspiracy to thwart the government that can only be resolved by President Trump. That's a scary thought in its foundation. And the question that I posed to Patreon yesterday, I wrote and said, I'm a writer. I write for Forbes. I write about the freelance revolution. And I was wondering, how did this happen? That this guy who's sharing terrible rumors and terrible statements. How did he get on your site? What are your processes of reviewing your sites? How often do you take a look at the 500,000 people on your platform to make some decisions about who's doing bad stuff? Because there's always going to be, just statistically, you got 500,000 people on your platform, you're going to have hundreds of people that are bad seeds just because that's the number. Well, they haven't responded to me, and that worries me, because what I think it means is they don't have a way to do that on a regular basis. And I'm not sure very many of our platforms around the world do. So we have two challenges. On the one hand, we have the challenge of building together the reputation of the industry. And that's, by the rising tide, by talking about it, by writing about it, by getting companies to share their positive stories. The other side of it is we've got to be careful. We've got to continue to manage it so that as an industry, we're not allowing bad actors to destroy the reputation of this new industry. So I guess that's the thing that I would suggest. I think that the corona pandemic has created tremendous opportunity, but I'm not sure that the full amount of the opportunity now will be there in 5 years. I think that many companies who have said you can work remotely are going to miss the collaboration of people sitting side by side. And so I think you're going to see a reduction in the openness to everything can be remote that we've been hearing about for the last 6 to 12 months as things change. And that will force freelancers to give some thought to how they want to operate.
Yeah, I like how you put it that we need to talk about it and show example. And our program this month includes dialogues with corporate representatives.
Very important.
Yeah, who either implemented freelance talent acquisition strategies or only at the early stage of it. And we do want to show example to the rest that, this is a possibility. And my mission is by doing that to create assignments for freelancers to make their job easier.
Yep. Now, can I add one thing to what you're saying? And that is, so what we know is that as people have gone remote and as organizations have seen remote work, the difference between being a freelancer working remote and a full-time employee working remote is getting smaller and smaller. So you're going to see more openness because the managerial challenge is not terribly different at that point. But there's another piece to it. And that is we have got to help organizations understand two other things. One is that we're not talking about freelancers or employees. We're talking about freelancers and employees. The idea is a flexible, blended workforce. There, people work together over time. Second thing that I'm inviting organizations to think about is that the Gen Zs are already thinking like freelancers as their employees. They're already asking for the same kinds of things that are driving freelancers out. So we're creating a freelance light generation right now, and the very skills that companies need to learn to manage full-time freelancers, in many cases, are the skills that managers will need to manage full-time employees who have many of the same, who want many of the same qualities in their full-time work that define freelancing. So it's a very interesting time.
Yeah. I also like another, I like all of your articles, by the way.
You're very nice to say that. Thank you. You and my mother. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. No, but really, there is one specific quote I'd like to cite right now where you says, I think it sounds, freelance pioneers are eager to hear what one another is doing, learning and planning. And it comes from a place of a shared enthusiasm for the space and its possibilities.
Yeah.
That's absolutely to the point, because I can second that in preparation for this particular event, I've seen so much enthusiasm and help coming out of this wider community. And everyone is so enthusiastic about the fact that we're doing something together.
Yes.
But the question is, okay, enthusiasm is fantastic, and that's the driving source. But what can we do more to accelerate the freelance revolution?
It's a great question. And what I would say is, if I go back to those 5 things that freelancers want, well, let's take each of them in turn and it will help. So the first is they want work. And implicit in that is that we know about these freelancers. When there are 20 million freelancers on a site, it's very hard to think about them as more than widgets. But somehow or another, we have the challenge of rethinking how we address the people on our platforms, that they're not inventory, they're real people with real goals and real dreams and real skills. And so the first thing is, the more we can help people on the site to get to know each other, the more it starts to feel like a community and the more I'm willing to invest in it. Right now, so many people are investing in platforms only like this because they think it's kind of like, well, I have to drive for Uber and Lyft and Juno and Didi and all these others, so I'll be on all of them. I hope that more and more platforms do the things that need to be done to make people feel loyal. Not loyal foolishly, but loyal because they're getting the value out of it. So the first thing is I'm excited by platforms that are smaller rather than bigger. I don't mean 100 or 200. I mean, you can have 5,000 or 6,000 people on a platform. But when you get up to 55 or 60 or 100,000 people, it's very hard to build community unless you break it down and create sub-communities as a company like Fiverr does. That's the first. Second is they want more opportunity, right? We said it's not only they want work, they want more flow of opportunity. That happens when we build the community to share and to find work for one another. And so really important to incentivize the people on the community to invest in the community, to invest in the platform rather than only their own situation. And there are some platforms that are trying to do that. Brain Trust and Contra are two examples of new platforms, in this case in the US, they're really saying, how do I create a feeling of ownership across the entire community so that people are more willing to share, et cetera, et cetera. Third, we talked about the importance of a platform helping people to manage their business. It's really important. One of the questions that any platform ought to ask its members on a regular basis is, what are the areas of managing your business can we help you with? So, for example, do you have information on how demand is changing? Do you have information on what kinds of industries are particularly eager to hire our freelancers? You have information on what kinds of, tools can we use to budget or manage our finances better? Do I have a good profile and a good bio? Am I getting the work because I look good as well as do good? Fourth, when we talk about future proofing, I believe every platform ought to be an accelerator, ought to be an incubator, ought to be in the business of helping the freelancers to stay up to date in their skills and their knowledge, not just the tech, whatever their profession is, but also the skill set. What we know is that communication is a really important part of getting work as a freelancer. The planning is a really important part. The teamwork is a really important part. So are you good as a team player or are you not? Are you good as a communicator or are you not? We ought to be helping people with that. So if you do those four things and you do it through connectedness, that feeling a part of something, wow. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's a very important way to do it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It sounds like even if you are a platform or a community, you have to be the guide for your members to help them to succeed in the job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. Yep. And finally, John, why revolution?
Say that again.
Why revolution?
Oh, well, part of it's I want to sell articles, but the other part of it is relative. I'm 68. I started consulting when I was 26 as a new PhD, and I can tell you that over the 40 years since. I have seen freelancing truly as a revolution in the sense that it is a legitimate and increasingly respected and respectable career. It's not the thing that people do in between jobs. It's not the thing that people do before they look for a real job or after they've retired. It's all of those things. And it's wonderful that people see it as a legitimate path. For some people, it's part-time. For some people, it's full-time. And if I may give you my experience of my 40 years, I was a teacher at the university. Then I worked for 10 years at Exxon. Then I worked, helped to build two companies, and they both went public. Then I built another firm with some colleagues. And what was true during all of that time was two things. One is freelancing became more and more possible over the period, truly revolutionary in that respect. And the second is that the technology was revolutionary in terms of facilitating and enabling a whole different kind of freelancing than we ever saw before. I think it's going to change again. I think it's going to keep changing for a while. I think it's going to be very interesting. And I've got to tell you, I love these conversations with you and with the members of your community. And you'll see that over the next few weeks, I'm doing one in Russia, I'm doing one in the UK, I'm doing one in the US, I'm doing one somewhere else. I did one yesterday in Ireland. And for me, it's just a pleasure to be connected with these wonderful experiments going on, these wonderful projects going on around the world.
Thank you, John. And we need more advocates like you to talk about what's happening, because that is absolutely insightful and it's a pleasure to learn.
A pleasure to be part of this.
Thank you so much.
And you're doing great stuff. So I'm glad to be associated with it.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, hope to see you around, and thank you very much for this fantastic interview, and all the best.
Please do me one favor.
Yeah.
And that is walk up the block to the Sablon from the Grand Place and say hi to it for me. It was one of I had the privilege over 4 years where I worked for Exxon Chemical. Exxon Chemical, of course, in Europe is headquartered in Mechelen. And so I had the privilege of staying at the Amigo Hotel before it was renovated and got fancy again. And my favorite times were walking up to the Sablon for a good meal or an antique market on Saturday morning. So please say hi to them for me. It's a beautiful part of the city.
I will, for sure.
Good.
Okay, perfect. So let's consider this is the end. Well, thanks a lot. Really, really nice discussion, and appreciate it so much.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thanks, Elena.
Thanks, and take care. Cheers.